The problem is that within Orthodoxy, there's no consensus of how to gain autocephaly. It's an unsolved debate. There are at least two theories, whether it is, so to say, the mother church or whether it's Constantinople, but there is no consensus, and that makes the whole question very, very difficult. A next point I would like to address is the question about history and the historical debate. Both churches, meaning Moscow and Constantinople, have argued historically. On their websites, you can find documents which purport to prove that they, meaning the owner of the respective website, are right. They quote documents and canons, agreements and contracts. I am convinced, however, that there cannot be a solution which would be the result of a historical analysis. There's no interpretation of all these documents which would be so convincing that everybody, or at least many people from both sides, would say, yes, that is right, these documents show that Patriarch X is clearly right. Rather, there are good reasons which speak for the one side and which speak for the other. So a consensus cannot be found on the basis of historical documents. Most of these documents refer to the 17th century, a time when what is today the eastern part of Ukraine shifted politically to Russian dominance. At that time, too, the ecclesial belonging of the Kyiv metropolitan switched from Constantinople to Moscow step by step. Moscow was an emerging power then, and Constantinople had already for 200 centuries been under the Ottomans, who respected the autonomy of the Christians to a relatively high degree. But at the same time, there was no longer any idea about an Orthodox or Greek empire in that region. We can see that many of the events which happened then and which are discussed nowadays were not planned or part of a deliberate action, but rather took place because it was the easiest way to act, the one which seemed the most normal and appropriate. To interrogate the historical events for contemporary meaning and relevance, there are a couple of questions which we have to apply and which I will discuss now. The first of them is, what does it mean when a document or an agreement was not kept? There's a very similar answer. It means disobedience. One can easily argue that side A was obliged by the agreement to act in a certain way, and when it did not, it means that it did not fulfill its side of the contract, with all ensuing consequences. But that answer might be too simple. One could name here other cases in history when realities changed over time, regardless of any existing agreements. But one also could use the category of reception. What does it mean theologically if something is not kept by the church but changes, regardless of its formally correct character? A second question to address is, how much weight does a new or changed practice have over centuries? Does such a practice acquire legal significance over time? Is customary law a category which can or which even must be applied to church canons and to canon law? In other words, if we deny that customary law can change legal facts, then we would have to try to bring all ecclesial realities in accordance with the positive law. That would be very close to the position mentioned above, namely the one which regards any reflection from legal prescription simply as disobedience. A correction then would be the only logical remedy. However, not only personal and private experience, but also ecclesial life shows that this is impossible. There are always things, mostly of minor character, but sometimes also of higher importance, which function in a church not according of how they should. But they function, and sometimes they even acquire normativity. That means that it is not enough to invoke former agreements when they have been modified by a centuries-long practice. That, of course, cannot mean that everybody can do what they want regardless of what they have agreed earlier. Pacta sunt servanda, contracts must be kept, is one of the basic principles of our legal system, and our world would not function if everybody would act regardless of what he or she agreed earlier to do or not to do. That principle must not be put under question. But what I am arguing for is to note that there is a dynamic of life and also of church life which sometimes results in changes and even in changes of things and circumstances which were regarded as unchangeable.